Morning.
Always helps to unmute. Good morning. So why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning? And just to make sure that we are all kind of oriented and situated, I think probably doing this more for myself than anybody else. This is Political Science 1. This is class number 30620. It is Tuesday, April 28th. And thank you all for joining me this morning, whether you are watching this live as it happens or you are watching this as a recording. Do remember, of course, that all of our weekly Zoom meetings for this class are recorded and are available on our Canvas homepage via the Conference Zoom link, normally about 12 to 24 hours after the recording ends. So if you want to review anything that we talked about on the during the Zoom meeting today, you can go back and check it out, and that works out quite nicely. And just as a reminder, throughout our presentation this morning, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to open up your mic, ask your question, make your comment, or if you would rather not, you can also go ahead and ask your question or make a comment via the group chat, and I can respond to that as well. So it's really a pleasure having you with me this morning. And today we're going to go ahead and do several things. First thing is we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit, just a couple of brief announcements and reminders, logistical things about the class, that sort of thing. And then after we finish up with that, I will talk in as much detail as you want, pretty much, about the assignment that you are currently working on, which is our second test of the semester, test number 2. Remember, test number 2 is due this coming Thursday. That is April 30th at 11:59 p.m. Of course, that tacked onto that is the 3-day or 72-hour grace period that we have for all of our tests this semester, as well as all of our assignments this semester. So I'll talk a little bit about the logistics and process for the test. And once I've done that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about any of the concepts that are covered on test number 2. I mean, I won't directly give you answers to questions or anything like that, but if you're unclear on a concept that is covered on the test, you can ask me about it, and I'll be happy to clarify that for you as well. And I'm willing to do that for the entire 45-minute period that we are together this morning, if you have that many questions. And then finally, with any time that we have left over, I will go ahead and preview the next section of material that we'll start working on after we get done with test number 2. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking in depth about each of the 3 national government branches, Congress, the president, and the courts, in that order, because that's the order that the framers dealt with them in the Constitution. So I'll do kind of a brief overview of what we're looking for in talking about those 3 national government branches, and then specifically, I'll give you a brief overview of the note set that I just posted up for you on Canvas this morning. I just activated the Congress module and put the notes in there, and I'll give you a brief overview of the notes for Congress. And the Congress notes are part of a larger package of things that you'll need to be reading and watching for our next discussion forum post assignment that is due a week from this coming Thursday. So not this Thursday, but next Thursday. And let me just go ahead and quickly double check the date on that so I don't mess it up. Yeah, let me go to May. That would always be a good thing. So next Thursday, which is May 7th. So we'll talk a little bit about Congress as time permits. So that pretty much is the agenda for today. So why don't we go ahead and get started with that? So first of all, in terms of announcements and reminders, just a quick reminder that, if you need to contact me regarding anything having to do with the class or anything that you think that I can help you with, dealing with life at Long Beach City College, or just anything that's going on in your life right now, because remember, you're never alone. We're all in this together. I'm here to help you however I can. You can always go ahead and send me either an email or a Canvas message. You also have the ability to join me during the virtual student hours that I have live on Zoom twice a week. Those are every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. To be able to access that. And by the way, as I think I've mentioned before, during the student hours, I'm not lecturing, I'm not presenting information like I do during our weekly Zoom class meetings. Instead, I'm available to meet with you all one-on-one to talk about anything that you would normally come to talk to me about during my face-to-face student hours that I would normally have if we were back face-to-face on campus. You'd stop by my office in the T building and talk to me about whatever you need to talk to me about. That's the basic purpose of these virtual student hours. Now, if you want to access them, simply go to our class Canvas homepage, scroll down past the picture, go to the section labeled Basic Course Information, and right there towards the top of that section, you will see the Zoom link for my virtual student hours, as well as the password that you need to plug in to join my virtual student hours. And when you join my virtual student hours, you will initially find yourself in a virtual waiting room. And that simply means that I am currently working with another student. And as soon as I finish with that student, I will go ahead and bring you in from the virtual waiting room. We can chat one-on-one via live Zoom, and I can help you out with whatever I need to help you out with. So please do make use of those virtual student hours, especially remember, our tests are due this coming Thursday at 11:59 p.m. So if you have questions about the test that occur to you after our Zoom meeting ends today, you can, if you want to, join me tomorrow afternoon between 1:30 and 2:30 for those virtual student hours, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about the test or anything else that you need at that point as well. Okay, so those are just some things that I wanted to remind you about. So before we go ahead and talk specifically about test number 2, any questions, comments, problems, complaints, etc., about anything having to do with the class before we go ahead and move forward for this morning. So if you have a question or a comment, please unmute your mic, ask your question, make your comment, or please feel free to put it in the group chat as well. So any questions, comments, whatever, before we move forward this morning? Anybody? Okay, very good. So let's go ahead and move on. And so let's go ahead now and talk specifically about test number 2, the assignment that you all are currently working on. So hopefully, if you can, you might want to go ahead and pull up test number 2. Test number 2 is accessible by clicking on the assignments tab in the left-hand column of our Canvas homepage, then scrolling down to the link labeled test number 2, clicking on that, and there it is. So first thing, before I take any content questions, any information questions that you have about anything going on with test number 2, I want to just remind you about how test number 2 works in terms of its format, its process, the logistics, that sort of thing. Because as I think I mentioned a little bit, if you joined me here last week, test number 2 is pretty much the exact same format as what you were used to with the first test that we took this semester, test number 1, back when we were still face-to-face, and we took that test, you know, timed in our classroom in the T building, that sort of thing. So it's pretty much the same format. So if you take a look at part 1 of the test, you will notice I have 22 terms listed there for you. Those are all terms that we have learned about since test number 1, because remember, the tests in this class are not cumulative. So in part 1, you'll see terms from our what we've learned about from public opinion, mass media, political parties, interest groups, as well as campaigns and elections. So everything that we've talked about since test number 1. So when you get ready to start working on test number 2, if you haven't done so already, go through those 22 terms, figure out which 8 of those 22 terms you can do the best job of answering. And for each of the 8 terms that you choose, in about 3 to 4 complete sentences each, you are giving me a basic definition of that term. You're also telling me how that term is significant to us. In other words, how does that particular concept that you're writing about connect with or relate to other stuff that we've been talking about in the class? And that's basically what we mean when we talk about providing significance. And again, that's about 3 to 4 sentences each for any 8 of the 22 terms that you choose. And each of those 8 responses is worth a maximum of 7.5 points. So the total of 60 points possible in part 1 of the test. And that is exactly the same as it was with test number 1. Now, part 2 of the test is the mini essay section, just like last time. And there I give you 4 potential mini essay questions that you can choose from. And so again, read through those 4 questions carefully, choose the 1 question out of the 4 that you feel you are best able to answer. And in approximately 5 paragraphs, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, do whatever you need to do to completely answer the question, but you respond to the question in about 5 paragraphs. Okay. And that's pretty much how it works. Part 2 of the test, that 5 paragraph response to one of the 4 essay questions is worth a maximum of 40 points. So that's pretty much the same as test number 1, with 2 important differences that I want to remind you about. We also talked about this last week. So the first major difference is that this test and also our 3rd test, our last test for the semester, which we'll have at the end of May, beginning of June, this test is completely open book and open note. So as you are working on test number 2, feel free to have all the assigned readings in front of you, refer to them as much as you want. Feel free to have all the class notes that I've provided you for each module of information, have those in front of you, refer to them as much as you want. If you want to go back and review some of the information from any of the videos, the crash course videos or whatever, please feel free to do that as well. So again, test number 2, completely open book and open note. Okay. The other difference, of course, from test number 1 is that you do not have a strict time limit for completing test number 2. So in other words, I'm not going to force you to take the test using Proctorio or one of those other really rather torturous Canvas plugins that I could be using. So in other words, this is not going to be one of those tests where you sit down in front of your computer with your camera on, you take the test, you have a certain amount of time, maybe 85 minutes to take the test, and during that entire time, the camera is watching you to make sure that you're not looking at notes or books or any other source of information. We don't do that in this class. So this test is not timed and it is completely open book and open note. Obviously, the due date for the test is this coming Thursday at 11:59 p.m. plus that 3-day or 72-hour grace period tacked on. And so when you actually finish up with the test and you submit the test via Canvas, you do that right there where the assignment for test number 2 is listed. You can submit the test. There'll be kind of a red button at the very top of the assignment on the right, in the right-hand side, you click on, and there's 2 ways that you can submit the test. You can either submit your test by opening up a text box, and you can either, type all your information for the test into the text box and submit it that way, or you can cut and paste information into the text box. Or if you'd rather, you can go ahead and submit your test to me as a file. But notice, as it says there in the instructions for the test, only 3 file formats that you can use. You can submit your test to me as a Microsoft Word file, so either as a .doc file or a .docx file, or you can also submit it to me as a .pdf file. Those are the 3 that I accept. Okay, and submit that through Canvas. Please do not give me a Google Doc file or anything else. And please only submit your test answers to me through Canvas, through the assignment itself. Please do not send me an email with an attached file. Please don't send me an email saying, well, you now have access to my Google Doc file and you can start editing it if you want to. Please don't do it that way. All right. So those are all sort of the logistical and process details for test number 2. Any questions, comments, problems about any of that? And you can either open up your mic and ask me a question, or you can put your question in the group chat. So any questions about the actual process or logistics for taking test number 2? Anybody? Okay, great. And, one more thing that I should mention, again, due date Thursday at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. If you are happening to be going through something right now, and let's face it, right now, a lot of us are going through a lot of stuff. So if you realize that you are not going to be able to make the due date for test number 2, or that you're not going to be able to make the 3-day grace period for test number 2, if you need more time than that extra 3 days, please do send me an email or a Canvas message and let me know. We can talk about it. We can work it out. But please, I want to do everything possible to make sure that you get test number 2 turned in when you are able to turn it in. All right. All right. So at this point, if you've had a chance to start looking at test number 2, or if you've actually had a chance to start working on test number 2, do you have any questions about the actual concepts, the actual information that is being covered in test number 2? So any questions about any of the information, any of the concepts listed in part 1, or any of the concepts that are discussed in the 4 mini essay questions in part 2? So any content questions at this time for test number 2? Anybody? And I'll wait just a little bit just to make sure you don't have any questions occur to you. And while I'm waiting, I should say, if you don't have any questions now, that's absolutely fine. But if questions come up between now and when the test is due or the grace period, please do feel free to send me a Canvas message. Feel free to send me an email. Feel free to join me during my virtual student hours tomorrow afternoon on Zoom between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if the virtual student hours don't work for you and you still want to meet with me one-on-one, virtual face to virtual face on Zoom, send me an email or a Canvas message and we can set up a time for an individual one-on-one Zoom appointment. So do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered. So one more time, any content questions, any information questions about anything covered in test number 2? Anyone? Okay. So in that case, what I want to do for the remaining time that we have available, and looks like we've got about 24 minutes left together this morning, I do want to go ahead and preview the next section of information that we'll be dealing with once we get past test number 2. And that is going to be a pretty in-depth study of the 3 national government branches. So the 3 major pieces that our national government is broken up into. Starting next week with Congress, the folks who have a lot of jobs, but their main job is to make national government laws. And then the week after that, we'll talk about the president and the rest of the executive branch, the folks whose job it is, among other things, to enforce national government laws. And the week after that, we'll talk a little bit about the courts, the federal judiciary, the folks whose main job is to interpret national government laws. That is to tell us what the laws actually mean in practice. Now, it makes sense. If you think about the information that we've covered so far this semester, both first in person towards the beginning of the semester and since then online, it makes sense that we get to talking in detail about the three national government branches at this point in the semester. Because think about it, the beginning of the semester, we started off by taking an in-depth look at our country's current political rule book, this thing called the US Constitution. And we focused on really trying to understand why our current Constitution says what it says and does what it does. So we talked about the evolution or the development of the 13 American colonies to the 13 American states through the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and natural rights. We also talked about our first short-lived disastrous constitution that nearly caused the United States to implode in chaos, this thing called the Articles of Confederation. And then finally, we took all that information and applied it to our understanding of our current US Constitution itself, kind of understood the foundation that our government is built on. Once we did that and we took test number 1, we have then spent our time since then, leading up to test number 2, talking about the various ways that the American public and American government officials communicate with each other back and forth through these linkage mechanisms. So we talked first about the really significant role that public opinion plays in our political system, and then we looked in depth at each of the 4 linkage mechanisms themselves. We talked about mass media, we talked about political parties, interest groups, and then most recently, we talked about elections and election campaigns. And remember the main point in talking about these linkage mechanisms. We said that properly functioning linkage mechanisms are crucial to the survival of a democratic political system anywhere in the world, but certainly here in the United States. And we were trying to figure out, are our 4 linkage mechanisms, media, parties, interest groups, campaigns, and elections, are they still providing enough information consistently back and forth between the people and the government so that we can maintain a political system where the people are ultimately in charge of what government does? And I think from our discussions and from the reading that you've been doing and the thinking that you've been doing on all of this over the past several weeks, you may have some significant doubts in your mind about whether or not our linkage mechanisms today are doing enough in terms of communicating back and forth between the people and the government. So now that we've talked about and learned about all that stuff, the next natural step in our understanding of how our governmental system works in the United States is to go ahead and talk about the basic political structures, the basic institutional pieces of the U.S. national government. And so basically over the next 3 weeks, as we learn about Congress and the president and the courts, I want you to think back to a really rather important concept that we talked about towards the beginning of the semester when we were talking about the various things, the various concepts, the various ideas that the framers, the authors of our current Constitution, put into the document as they were creating it back in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And remember how we said, as we were talking about that back then, that the framers were attempting, among other things, to create a national government for the United States that was both strong enough to maintain order in society, but not so strong that it threatened the people's natural rights. Remember that? So we said that on the one hand, the framers wanted our new national government under our new Constitution to be not as strong and as abusive as the British government was during the colonial period, but at the same time, they also wanted our new national government to be significantly stronger than it was under our first disastrous Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Now, remember when we were talking about this and we said that the framers built a couple of specific structures and processes into the Constitution to try and create a national government that would be strong enough, but not too strong. And one of those things that they did is they borrowed this idea from a French political philosopher, a guy by the name of Montesquieu, this idea that we call separation of powers and checks and balances. Remember that? Hopefully that rings a bell back when we were still meeting face to face. And if you recall, the key there was this idea of separation of powers. And remember what separation of powers was all about. What the framers did is they realized that any government in the world had three basic functions that it needed to carry out on a regular basis. Any functional government had to be able to make laws. It also had to be able to enforce those laws once they were made. And finally, the government also needed to be able to interpret those laws, to tell the people and the government what those laws actually mean in practice, and how you obey them, and all that sort of thing. So all successful governments have to make laws, enforce laws, and interpret laws, right? That's what they all have to do. And so the framers said, look, under the British government, back before we were 13 American states, back when we were 13 British colonies, the British government was organized in such a way, and it's still organized that way today, that the same folks within the British governmental structure, that is the British Parliament led by the Prime Minister, the same people in the British government had all three of those basic functions of government. They made the laws, they enforced the laws once they made them, and they also interpreted the laws. So the Parliament, led by the Prime Minister, had the legislative function, the executive function, and even part of the judicial function. And the framers said that was a really bad idea, that was disastrous. Why? Because since the Parliament controlled all three of those functions, it made laws, it enforced laws, it interpreted laws. That gave them way too much power, and it allowed the British Parliament to abuse its power and to take away the colonists' natural rights. That's one of the reasons why we revolted from the British government in the American Revolution. So when the framers sat down to create our current Constitution in 1787, they said, okay, we're not doing that. We are not having that same fusion of power system that the British government did. Instead, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to have separation of powers. We're going to have separate groups of people within the national government, with one group making the laws, that's Congress, a second group led by the president, the executive branch, enforcing the laws, and a third separate group within the national government, the judiciary, interpreting the laws, right? And the hope was, with separation of powers, that the three branches of government could work together cooperatively to get things done. But since each of the three powers were given to separate groups, the national government would not become too powerful, would not become abusive. So that's what we said towards the beginning of the semester about separation of powers and why the framers did it that way in our current Constitution. Now, is that still making sense to us? Any questions about separation of powers at this point?
Was there precedent before? Like, did a nation ever attempt this policy, or was it the first time?
It was the first time. As we said towards the beginning of the semester, the idea of separation of powers existed only in dusty books of political philosophy. Some folks recommended this system, like Montesquieu, the French liberal philosopher, but no one had actually ever tried it before. So the framers were taking a big risk, right? Oh, okay. Now, the other thing I should say, and the one element of separation of powers that I didn't emphasize early in the semester when we talked about it, and it becomes very important for us right now, before we start talking about Congress and the other branches, is that the framers assumed that if separation of powers was going to work, was going to be successful, and was going to be sustainable over time, then each of the three national government branches, Congress, the president, and the courts, each of those three branches would have to be roughly co-equal in terms of the amount of power that they had. So, for example, you couldn't have one branch have way more power than the other two. They all had to have about the same equal level of power. And that makes sense, right? That's really logical, because if one branch becomes significantly more powerful than the others, that might enable that branch to start stealing powers from the other two weaker branches, and then separation of powers breaks down. It ceases to exist, and we're in big trouble, right? And so that was the framers' assumption. And the reason why I mention that now is because when the framers created Congress, the president, and the courts in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, they designed them with that assumption. They tried to design Congress, the president, and the courts in such a way that each branch had just about the same equal level of power and authority, okay? That's what they tried to do. And for a long time in our political history under the Constitution, the framers were actually pretty successful at doing that, okay? For a long time in our political history, Congress, the president, and the courts all had about the same level of power. But guess what? If you look at sort of the balance of power amongst the three national government branches today, you'll notice that things have changed. That today, power is pretty unbalanced amongst the three national government branches. And if you ask the American people about this, which political scientists and other folks do all of the time in public opinion surveys and that sort of thing, if you ask the American people today, which of the three national government branches is the most powerful and potentially the most dangerous, most everyone says the president by far. And if you ask the American people which of the three national government branches is probably the weakest and the least dangerous, most of them will say Congress, okay? So most people today, even if they pay just a little bit of attention to what government does in the US, they see this really big imbalance of power amongst the three national government branches. Now, this is not what the framers intended, right? The framers wanted all three branches to have about equal levels of power and authority. So a couple of questions that we want to focus on as we talk about Congress next week, and the president the week after that, and the courts the week after that. And that is, first of all, how did this happen? How did we get from the framers intending for all three branches to have about the same level of power and authority to where we are today, where power amongst the three branches is pretty much unbalanced? That's the first question. Then the second question that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks is it necessary? Is it actually a good and necessary thing that the power amongst the three national government branches today is unbalanced? Is it necessary for the survival of the United States to have an extremely powerful president and a significantly weaker Congress? So those are the two questions that we're going to look at over the next few weeks. And we're going to try and answer those questions by taking an in-depth look first about Congress, then about the president, then finally about the courts. So any questions about kind of our main focus and those two major questions that we're going to be attempting to answer over the next 3 weeks? You can unmute your mic or put something in the group chat. Any questions, comments, problems about any of that stuff? Anyone? Okay, so in the last few minutes that we have left, I want to call your attention to the notes that you'll be looking at for next week. Because remember, this week, we're working on test number 2, but next week, so due next Thursday, a week from this coming Thursday, that is May 7th, will be your next discussion forum post dealing with the first of the 3 national government branches that the framers dealt with in the Constitution in Article 1, and that is the U.S. Congress. So just this morning, about a half hour before we got together here on Zoom, I went ahead and put up, I opened up the module for Congress on our modules page, and I gave you the notes that you'll be looking at next week. And in conjunction with those Congress notes that I've just given you, along with the assigned readings that I've given you, and there'll be a couple of crash course videos I'm going to post up on Canvas a bit later today dealing with Congress. You want to use all that information to help you respond to that discussion forum post on Congress due a week from this coming Thursday. Okay. So in the last few minutes that we have left, I just wanted to go ahead and sort of give you a preview, kind of a brief overview of the Congress notes that I posted for you earlier this morning. And when you open up the file, what you will notice is that the notes are rather lengthy, right? So I give you a lot of information about the US Congress. And the notes are divided basically into, I mean, there's 4 sections, but there are 3 sections of the 4 that I want you to pay really specific attention to, right? The first section of the notes gives you a discussion of what the framers were thinking about, what the framers' priorities were, what the framers' fears were as they actually sat down to create the institution of Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. And if you take a look at the information that I give you in that first section in Roman numeral number 1 of the Congress notes, what you will notice is that the framers, when they sat down to create the institution of Congress back during the summer of 1787, the framers actually feared Congress. The framers believed that Congress had the greatest potential of the 3 national government branches to become the most powerful and the most dangerous of the 3 national government branches. So they felt that Congress, more so than the courts, more so than the president, had the greatest possibility of abusing its power, spinning out of control, and stealing people's natural rights. And the reason I call your attention to that is because that is exactly the opposite of how we perceive Congress today, right? As I said just a few minutes ago, today, if you ask the average American, you know, which of the 3 national government branches is the strongest, the most powerful, potentially the most dangerous, barely anyone's going to tell you Congress. Most Americans are going to say, oh, it's the president by far. And they'll give you examples. They say, well, remember President Nixon back in the 1970s? He abused his power. He was really kind of dangerous. Or President Reagan or President Clinton. People will give you these examples, right? But very few people in the US today will say, oh, yeah, Congress is the most powerful and the most dangerous. Most people today see Congress as being this rather weak and ineffective joke. Now, that raises a really interesting question that I answer for you in the first part of your Congress notes. And that interesting question is, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from the framers fearing that Congress could become the most powerful and most dangerous branch and spin out of control and take away the people's natural rights to where we are today, where most people don't worry about Congress? They say, oh, well, Congress, they're mostly incompetent. They're kind of crooked sometimes, but, you know, they're really nothing to worry about. They're not dangerous. They don't really get much done anyway, so who cares, right? How did we get from there to here? Well, the answer is simple, but it might be kind of surprising. And I talk about that in section Roman numeral number 1. The reason why Congress is perceived today as weak is because of the framers themselves. Because here's the thing, because the framers were so afraid of Congress abusing its power and spinning out of control, the framers were very careful when they created and structured Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 is probably the most detailed section of the Constitution. In other words, the framers spent a lot of time trying to very carefully specify what Congress could do and what Congress couldn't do. So the framers were trying to do a really delicate balancing act in creating Congress in Article 1. They wanted Congress to have sufficient powers and to be strong enough to do what it needed to do for society, but they didn't want Congress to have powers that it didn't need, that it could potentially abuse over time. And so that's what they did. The framers very carefully specified what Congress could do, what Congress couldn't do. So as I say in the notes, the framers very carefully tried to box Congress in to prevent Congress from becoming too powerful and abusive. And guess what? The framers actually did an extremely effective job of boxing Congress in. They probably did too effective of a job of boxing Congress in. And that's why today we see Congress as being overly weak. The framers probably put too many restrictions on Congress. Why? Because they were afraid of Congress spinning out of control. And so that's how we got from there, the framers fearing an all-powerful Congress, to here, we see Congress as being a big joke. Does that make sense? Any questions about that or comments? You can either open up your mic, put something in the group chat. Just had a question. Does Congress actually abuse their power? Most of the time, they don't. Most of the time, if anyone in the national government is going to try and test the limits, stretch their constitutional powers as far as they can, maybe farther than they should, it's going to be the president. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. I mean, you can find isolated examples of today and in recent decades where Congress might try and go a bit too far. But for the most part, Congress really is the junior partner amongst the three national government branches. Congress really is the weakest of the three. Does that make sense? Does that kind of get to your question? Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks for asking. Now, one more thing, because I know we are pretty much out of time. So if you don't mind sticking with me for a couple extra minutes, I did also want to call your attention to the second major section of the notes for Congress, Roman numeral number 2, because this gives you a really important insight into how members of Congress attempt to do their jobs from day to day. Because guess what? Most of the Congress notes, if you get to section 4, right, a little further on in the notes, in section 4, I list the 6 basic functions, the 6 major jobs that the framers gave to Congress. Now, the biggest job is to make national government laws, but the framers also gave Congress a lot of other things to do as well. And as I explain in the notes, the framers probably gave Congress too much to do. The framers probably gave Congress too many jobs. See, there is no way that members of Congress today can adequately and effectively carry out all 6 of their jobs, all 6 of their major functions equally well all of the time. It's simply impossible. They just can't do it. So every member of Congress, because of this, has to make an important decision. Every member of Congress has to decide, well, okay, I have these 6 jobs that I'm supposed to be carrying out on a regular basis. I can't do all of them equally well all of the time. So what are my priorities going to be? Which of those 6 jobs am I going to spend most of my time and attention and energy carrying out? And which other of those jobs am I going to kind of push aside off into a corner and hope that nobody notices, right? So every member of Congress today has to figure this out. Which of their jobs, of their 6 jobs, did they prioritize, and which ones do they kind of ignore as much as they possibly can? Well, guess what? Virtually all members of Congress figure out this priority in the same way. And I talk about it in section 2, in Roman numeral 2 of your Congress notes. Basically, here's how it works. Members of Congress will spend most of their time and energy and effort carrying out those jobs that give them the biggest reelection benefit. In other words, they will carry out those tasks which will help them get reelected again and again and again and again. And remember what we said earlier in the semester. Remember, we talked about this concept called the reelection obsession, and I define it for you again in section 2 of the notes. Remember, we said that the number one goal of virtually every elected official, and certainly every member of Congress, is reelection. So once a member of someone gets elected to Congress the first time, after that, their overwhelming priority is to do everything that they can do to get themselves reelected again and again and again and again for as long as they can. They want to keep their butts in office for as long as they can. Why? Because life is good as a member of Congress, right? There's lots of powers, lots of perks, lots of benefits. Why would you ever want to leave? And most of them don't. And so they're constantly trying to do whatever they can to keep getting reelected every time, right? Every 2 years for members of the House of Representatives, every 6 years for members of the Senate. And so these members of Congress, we love to criticize them, but they're not stupid people for the most part. They're really strategic thinkers. They have figured out that if they spend most of their time carrying out certain of their 6 basic functions, they can do that to improve and in some cases almost virtually guarantee that they will get reelected again and again and again and again. And so that's how members of Congress prioritize their jobs. If a function helps them get reelected, they'll do it 24/7. If it doesn't help them get reelected or might actually hurt their reelection chances, they won't do it. Now, is this good for the country, bad for the country? It's a mixed bag. Because guess what? Some of these functions that members of Congress enthusiastically do to help get themselves reelected really do provide benefits to the American people from day to day. But guess what? Some of those other functions that members of Congress ignore because they don't help them get reelected or they might actually hurt their reelection chances, those are things that are good for the country too, that members of Congress should be doing as well, but they don't. And so by prioritizing their functions based on their reelection obsession, in some ways, members of Congress help the American people, and in other ways, they hurt the American people. Does that make sense? Questions about any of this? I have a question from Guillermo. How does Congress separate their power in a bicameral legislature? Well, guess what? For the most part, and I talk a little bit about that in section 3 of your notes, the section labeled House and Senate differences. For the most part, if Congress as a whole is going to do anything, the House and the Senate have to be able to work together. They have to be able to cooperate. Now, as you will see, there are a few functions that only the House engages in and the Senate doesn't. And there are a few functions that only the Senate engages in, but the House doesn't. But for the most part, if Congress is going to move forward and get things done, both houses have to be able to work together. And that fact leads us to the second part of Guillermo's question on the group chat. What are some of the biggest conflicts that become barriers for progress? Well, right now, it's the dramatically rising levels of partisan and ideological polarization. Bless you. Remember how we said that, over the past few decades, Republicans have become much more angrily and bitterly divided from Democrats and vice versa, right? Conservatives today hate liberals and they see the other side as being evil and idiots and they hate America and blah, 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 right? That's the biggest barrier to progress, because guess what? If both houses of Congress are going to work with each other, and if each house of Congress is going to get things done themselves internally, there has to be cooperation amongst the Republican members of each house of Congress and the Democratic members of each house in Congress. If they can't cooperate, if they can't compromise, essentially nothing gets done. And that is the biggest problem that we are facing right now, even during this COVID-19 crisis. Congress has been very slow in responding and doing some of the things that it should be doing to help the American people through this crisis, especially in terms of economic assistance and that sort of thing for those of us who have lost our jobs or we've had to close our businesses or whatever it is, right? And Congress has been pretty slow off the mark in providing some needed assistance. Why? Because Republicans and Democrats in Congress can't agree on how to do it, right? And what makes this even more challenging is that right now, the lower house of Congress, the House of Representatives, is controlled by the Democratic Party. They have a majority of seats in the House, whereas the upper house of Congress, the Senate, is controlled by the Republican Party. They have a majority of seats in that chamber. So Democrats in the House can't agree with Republicans in the Senate. Nothing gets done, or very little gets done. Okay. So any other questions before I go ahead and wrap things up and end our Zoom meeting for this week? Okay. So remember, this Thursday, plus the 72-hour grace period, test number 2 is due to be submitted via Canvas. If you have questions about test number 2, send me an email, send me a Canvas message. Join me during my virtual student hours tomorrow afternoon. That's Wednesday afternoon on Zoom between 2:30 and 3:30 Pacific Daylight Time in the afternoon. And if you have questions and you want to meet with me one-on-one on Zoom, but you can't meet those during that time, please send me a text, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, and we can set up a one-on-one Zoom appointment where we can talk. Okay. Next Thursday, your discussion forum post assignment on Congress is due. And next week, this time, Tuesday morning from 9 to 9:45 or thereabouts, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about Congress and then preview our discussion of the presidency. So until we meet again, anytime, anything that I can assist you with, you know how to find me, you know how to get in contact with me, please do. You are going to be successful, not just in this class, but you are going to be successful in getting through this crisis that we are all currently facing, because you are not alone. We are all in this together. I'm here for you. I've got your back. So be safe, be well, hang in there, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining me today. It was great seeing you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.